Well, the losses remain what they were the last time we spoke, roughly 1,500 to 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers a day,
Wow.
perhaps half or more of that killed. Remember that the Ukrainian armed forces do not have at this point a very developed casualty evacuation system. Their hospitals are overwhelmed, overburdened. It's a terrible situation. The Russians are in no hurry. I think you've got President Putin who looks at the strategic landscape and says several things. First of all, Europe is falling apart. It's only a matter of time until the insane ruling elite, the globalist elite, if you will, that has dragged Europe into this abyss that we've created for them, is gone. If you wait long enough, you're going to see new governments emerge in Paris and Berlin and so forth. This is going to happen whether the CIA and MI6 want it to happen or not. It could even happen in London. Certainly could happen in Scandinavia and other countries. So that's part of it. The other part is there's an election, at least in theory, that's going to happen in November. The Russians don't understand our political system, nor do they understand how hopelessly rigged and corrupt our voting system is. But I think they're going to take the position, well, why don't we wait and see who comes out on top in November, and we may see a change of direction in the United States or Washington. Of course, that's problematic. Then the third thing is, remember, the Russians don't want to rule Ukrainians. I mean, if they have to cross the Dnieper River and head west, they can do it. There's certainly nothing to stop them. But that means that they've got to go in and eventually take at least administrative control and responsibility as a government for Western Ukraine. They don't want it. They don't want anything to do with it. They know the Ukrainians don't want them, and they don't want them. They're sitting on the terrain right now that is overwhelmingly Russian. That's what they've done. They want to consolidate that. They want to make it part of Russia because the people there are Russians. They went in to liberate them from the oppressive Ukrainian government. So it's a kind of interesting situation where you have the reluctant victor and the unwilling conqueror. I mean, if you look at the map, you could go all the way out to that black line beyond Bakhmut and Advika.
Right.
You could conceivably go up to Zaporizhia, you obviously Kharkov, Kupiansk. But when you go much further, you're overrunning Ukrainian areas where the people really are Ukrainian. I don't think they want to do it, and they have no appetite for it. This is part of the big lie that's being perpetrated by the neocons and the various lobbies that, oh yeah, Putin wants to conquer Eastern Europe. Oh yeah, he can't wait. It's absurd. It's nonsense. It's expensive. It's unnecessary. It's counterproductive.
Chris, put the map up again. Can you make a fair argument, Colonel, that the Russians have virtually come very close to achieving their end goals already?
Oh, I think so. I mean, the only things that remain for them really are Odessa and Kharkov, because those are two historically Russian cities with large Russian-speaking populations. And they would like to see those back under Russian control. And up until recently, there was some discussion of a willingness to negotiate over Odessa. Again, we assume that if the Russians control Odessa, that nothing can move in or leave Odessa from Ukraine. And I don't think there's any particular interest in that. They would like to see this neo-Nazi fascist regime steeped in corruption removed from Kiev. They have not wanted to go in and do it themselves. They would prefer that the Ukrainians dispose of these people the way the Italians disposed of Mussolini. That may yet happen too. We don't know. Anything is possible at this point because the government in Ukraine is on its last legs. The Ukrainian nation is dying, frankly. They have no more men to spend, and dragging them back from overseas is not working very well. Governments around Ukraine are unwilling to become press gangs for this corrupt Ukrainian government. So right now, I think Mr. Putin wants to wait. If he's pushed hard, he'll move. But this doesn't make any difference to Russian responses to what might happen in the Middle East. And I think it's a mistake to assume that we have somehow or another tied down the Russians in a way that makes it impossible for them to intervene decisively on the side of Iran or even Turkey if Turkey were to enter the fray. That's a mistake. They could, and they will.
Here's what the British military thinks of the state of affairs in Ukraine today. It's a bit absurd, but I'd like you to comment on it. It's from yesterday, cut number 11.
It's costing them over 1,000 troops a day. In the past 24 hours, the Russians have lost over 1,300 troops. They've lost over 28 artillery systems. They've lost over 12 tanks. And they're losing those sorts of numbers on a daily basis. And that is, frankly, unsustainable, no matter how big your military force is, no matter how capable it is.
Do you agree with any of that?
Not really. You would lose in a normal war 12 tanks a day just to mechanical problems. That's possible. The rest of it just sounds fantastic to me. I mean, Russia has taken losses, but all of those losses have been dwarfed by what the Ukrainians have taken. The Russians also have no problems with recruiting. They have no problems with manpower. They've got all that they need, and they've got plenty of people who will volunteer to fight. I don't see the evidence for his statements. But then again, remember, we continue to live the lie about what's happening in Ukraine until we can't. That's the mentality. It always reminds me of that final scene in Untergang, the end of Hitler's regime, where one of the ladies in the hallway turns to Hitler just before he walks into his room and shoots himself and says, "But mein Führer, what about the inevitable victory?" And of course, he looks at her and scoffs, goes into the room and shoots himself. So I think he's in the same category with those foolish people that believed what they believed until the Soviet and American forces actually arrived in Berlin.
Here's President Putin commenting on the Western buildup of missiles in Germany. I'd like you to pay careful attention to what he says at the very end. We will take mirror measures. Cut number 1.
The situation recalls the events of the Cold War era. If the U.S. implements such plans, we will consider ourselves free from the previously imposed one-sided moratorium on the deployment of medium and shorter-range strike systems. We will take mirror measures for their deployment.
I believe he's talking about the American and Western threats to use missiles that were once negated by a treaty until President Trump pulled us out of the treaty. And now he's saying we'll take mirror measures to resist it. What does he mean?
Well, some of your viewers will remember the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which eliminated the whole Pershing II class of missiles and warheads. And we're in a similar situation. We're now threatening to deploy that kind of capability to Germany, potentially, I would say, also Western Poland. I'd be surprised if that were not part of it. And that reduces the flight time 10 to 15 minutes from those locations to the Soviet nuclear arsenal, and obviously to their early warning radars and other important military installations bound up with the Russian deterrent. And he's saying not, which I think is very important, not that we'll outbuild you and create a bigger, superior missile force. He's simply saying, we will match your actions. I think that's, from my standpoint, I'm happier to hear that than I am to hear what I think we would have heard from Brezhnev and Andropov and so forth, which is, I'm going to overwhelm you and build more than you've ever seen. This is all tragic because it's all unnecessary. We destroyed the structure of arms control. Now, arms control was never popular with the neocons in Washington, D.C., who are always interested in bullying everybody and believe in overwhelming strength that can be employed at will. That's very dangerous, as you and I know, in the nuclear age. It's not a good answer anyway. But that's been the attitude among those who don't like arms control. Arms control in and of itself is never enough. You have to pay attention. You have to maintain surveillance. You have to maintain vigilance. You have to ensure that your capability is enough to deter. That's very different, though, from what we are talking about. We don't need that capability in Germany or Western Poland to deter anything. In fact, what we're doing is something that's very provocative that could result in not just what he's saying, but potentially a war that nobody really wants, no one in their right mind. So the structure of arms control is never enough on its own, and we understand that. But to throw it all out was never a good idea. And remember that during the period of time when we were reliant on many of these treaties, we would from time to time discover what we thought was a breach of the agreement in some fashion. And then you have to make a decision. Do I go ahead and protest this and then alert the Soviet opponent to the idea that we know about them more than they would like us to know? In other words, do we want to reveal that our intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance complex is that good? And so many times we've overlooked their breaches. They've also overlooked ours. And we have breached some of these agreements. The notion that we're wearing white hats and are all Eagle Scouts is misleading. The whole thing is a disaster. It all needs to stop, but you can't get anybody in Washington to think that way because, again, Washington is donor-occupied territory. Everyone is being brainwashed anyway about the imminent threats that are presented that don't exist. And so everyone will ignore you if you suggest that this is a bad idea. But it's a very bad idea, and what's developing is extremely dangerous.
Colonel Douglas MacGregor, a great conversation. We went a little longer than usual, but everybody misses you, not the least of whom is I. Thank you very much for your time, dear friend. I hope we can visit with you again next week.
Okay, and just to make sure I go with you to Italy next time. I'll be
Deal.
Hello listener, I am Sabir and I have made this video to help you with learn English. আজকে আমরা আলোচনা করব appropriate preposition সম্পর্কে। ইংরেজিতে একই শব্দের সঙ্গে ভিন্ন ভিন্ন প্রিপোজিশন ব্যবহৃত হয়ে ভিন্ন ভিন্ন অর্থ প্রকাশ করে। আবার একই অর্থ প্রকাশ করার জন্য বিভিন্ন বক্তা বিভিন্ন প্রিপোজিশন প্রয়োগ করে, এতে ভুল ভ্রান্তির উদ্ভব ঘটে। সেজন্য প্রথাগতভাবে কোনো শব্দের সঙ্গে অন্য কোনো প্রিপোজিশন ব্যবহার করতে হবে, তা ইউজ এর মধ্যে স্থিরকৃত হয়ে আছে, সেগুলোকে অ্যাপ্রোপ্রিয়েট প্রিপোজিশন বলা হয়। নিম্নে অ্যাপ্রোপ্রিয়েট প্রিপোজিশনের ব্যবহার দেখে কিছু সেন্টেন্স গঠন করা হলো। আমরা এখন অ্যাপ্রোপ্রিয়েট প্রিপোজিশন এর ব্যবহার এবং এক্সাম্পলগুলো খেয়াল করব। অ্যাবিড বাই, মেনে চলা, এটা একটা প্রিপোজিশন। ফর এক্সাম্পল, দ্য স্টুডেন্ট মাস্ট অ্যাবিড বাই দ্য রুলস অফ ডিসিপ্লিন। অ্যাবিড উইথ অর্থ হচ্ছে সঙ্গ থাকা। ফর এক্সাম্পল, God abides with everybody। আচ্ছা, abide in অর্থ বাস করা। abide in, for example, Jasmine abide in Dhaka with her husband। abound in প্রাচুর্যপূর্ণ হওয়া। fish abound in the heroes and bills of Bangladesh। abhorrence of অর্থ হচ্ছে ঘৃণা। everybody should have an abhorrence of barbarity। absent from অর্থ হচ্ছে অনুপস্থিত থাকা। I was absent from the meeting। absorbed in মগ্ন, he is absorbed in troubles। abstain from বিরত থাকা। everybody should abstain from smoking। accuse of অভিযুক্ত হওয়া। the master was accused of robbery। তো আমাদের আজকের ভিডিও অ্যাপ্রোপ্রিয়েট প্রিপোজিশনে এই পর্যন্তই ছিল। ভিডিওটি ভালো লাগলে অবশ্যই লাইক, কমেন্ট এন্ড শেয়ার আর সাবস্ক্রাইব মাই ইউটিউব চ্যানেল।